Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Foose. I'm with the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library, and delighted to see you all here. I'd like to thank our many community partners, as well as our exhibits team here at Central Library for putting up this fabulous exhibit and the related programming. This is a big weekend, First Fridays and many other events happening regarding Mutanabbi Street. So I invite you to pick up a brochure at the back table if you don't have one already, and please come to any of the events this weekend that you can. In addition, the Mutanabbi Street Anthology is for sale at the back table for $20, and Bo has agreed to sign the copies if you purchase one today. On March 5th, 2007, a car bomb exploded on Mutanabbi Street, the historic center of Baghdad bookselling. More than 30 people died that day, and 100 more were injured. This terrorist attack was a blatant attempt to interrupt the free exchange of ideas and information that had been going on for hundreds of years. Bo Beausoleil, a San Francisco poet and bookseller, could not let this event fade into a footnote of war. So he formed the Mutanabbi Street Coalition, which led to the publication of an anthology of poetry contributed by writers from all over the world. He also collected a visual response from artists in the form of book art that now travels the world while holding community conversations about the silent and not so silent consequences of war. It's in this spirit of freedom that we are holding such a community conversation today. And I welcome Bo Beausoleil to the podium.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you all those who have heard me talk about this multiple times now and are still coming. This is billed as an intimate conversation about Mutanabbi Street, and so I do hope you'll have some questions about the project that we can make this less formal than my presentation. To briefly try and describe what motivated me to start the project, like many millions of Americans and people in the UK and people in Europe, I marched against the invasion of Iraq. But my feeling at the time was that it was fine with my government if I went on a march and then went to a rally, as long as at the end I went home. And it was at home that I felt that I was completely powerless to stop what was going on. And as the years went on, I would pick up the paper and see the carnage from day to day to day, but I could not see a personal connection with the Iraqi people. What I was getting from my government and from my media was that the Iraqi people were like me, but not quite like me. That they had values, but they didn't quite have the same values that I had. So I always felt this distance until March the 5th, 2007, when a car bomb was set off on Mutanabbi Street, and that is the street of the booksellers in Baghdad. And it's been there for more than 100 years. And that area of Baghdad is seen on the earliest maps of Baghdad as the scribes' quarter. If you were an Iraqi writer, if you were a student, you would come to Mutanabbi Street each week, often on Fridays. And it's where you would probably run into your professors. If you were an artist, you'd run into other artists. It simply was, it had like a magnetic pull, really, on the cultural community of Baghdad. And any writer or artist or reader who visited Baghdad would end up on Mutanabbi Street, where you could find books in all kinds of languages, where you could find everything from Shakespeare to Karl Marx. Even during the time of Saddam Hussein, you could buy banned books sold under the table. So it was an important cultural part of Baghdad. And in 2007, even though there was all kinds of killing all around Mutanabbi Street, the street had only suffered one small bombing in a stationery store a couple of years previous, but people felt that they were protected by this street. I mean, they felt that being amongst all of this literature a kind of safety, because who would bomb a street like that? Who would attack books? Who would attack culture? But we all know that those who either seek power or want to maintain power ultimately want to control everything that is written. The contents of every book. And at that point in the war in Iraq, there was an attempt to reduce Iraqi culture just to zero, to make it more malleable. So the car bombing, when I read about it in the newspaper, I realized immediately that as a bookseller, because I have a used bookstore in San Francisco, that's exactly where my store would be. And as a poet, that would be my cultural community that had been attacked. So the distance between the Iraqi people and myself just simply dropped away. I felt myself no different than any Iraqi civilian at that moment. And then I thought to myself that in a city like San Francisco that is filled with artists and writers, that there would be a response. And I waited for a week, I waited for 10 days, and nothing. There was no announcement of anything. And I felt like I just couldn't let this slip away. So I decided to do something, to organize a reading. And I went to the local public library, and I described what I wanted to do a memorial reading. And they said, of course, you can use our space. Much in the same way that Rochester has embraced this project, the Rochester Central Library and the outlying libraries. The same thing happened at the library in San Francisco. There is something about books and the people who deal with books, the people who handle books. Every book is filled with ideas, memories. There isn't any difference whether that book is in Iraq or is here on the shelf in Rochester. I felt like an attack on a street like Mutanabbi Street was essentially an attack on us all. So we had our first reading in 2007. I always say to people that I became an organizer like a lot of other people become organizers. First, I waited for somebody else to do something. And then when nobody did something, I knew I had to do something. So I also went to the San Francisco Center for the Book, which has printing presses and does a lot of work with book artists. And I told them what I was doing. And their immediate response was, how can we help? And they printed up the first poster for the reading, which was held in August of 2007. After we did the reading, we had a panel in a local city and an exhibit, and we had an exhibit at the San Francisco Center for the Book. And at that point, a lot of people wanted me to stop what we were doing because they felt like we had responded to what had happened. Now let's just get back to our lives. But I felt really strongly that we were still in the midst of that war. The Iraqi civilian population was still suffering. And their cultural community had been decimated and dispersed, really, around the globe. And I knew I had to continue. So I decided to try and find 130 letterpress printers. We had already found 43 by the time that we did the first reading and had the first exhibit. And I contacted a woman in the UK named Sarah Bodman. I ended up writing her and saying to her that I hear you wear your heart on the same ink-stained sleeve that I do. And she said later, how could I turn down somebody who would write me a note like that? You know? And so she helped and continues to help. She's the coordinator. We reached 130 broadsides after about a year and a half. Then I decided to issue a call to book artists because I had come to know a number of book artists and really admire the way that they entered the work. It was always on a really deep, personal level. And what they extracted from this core of an idea was often filled with parts of their personal life as well. And I really saw this art's response as being filled with personal responses to the bombing on Mutanabbi Street. So we issued this call. I wrote out the call and I sent it to Sarah Bodman in the UK, asked her to be the co-coordinator. And at the end of the letter, I said, do you think this is crazy to take this on? And she wrote me back and said, yeah, of course it's crazy. You know, let's do this. So we started, and our first goal was 130 book artists, because we wanted to approximate the number of people who were killed and wounded that day, which was 30 people killed and about 100 people wounded. And we reached 130, you know, in probably just about a year, I think. And we gave each artist about a year to complete their books. And when we got to 130, I wrote to Sarah and I said, you know, this was like far too easy. So let's go to 260. Let's double the amount. And she just wrote me back and said, of course, let's do this, you know. And she issued a further call through her newsletter more than once. But very slowly, we began to find more book artists. Names were passed to us. We found people's work online. I looked for people who I felt the idea of this project would resonate with them. And we just got responses from all over, from really interesting people. We didn't try to dictate beyond size and weight of books. We wanted people to really let the ideas of the project sink to the bone and then begin their work. So we got incredible responses, as you can see, from the work that's here in Rochester. Really extraordinary personal work. I said last night and I said today that one of the things that I feel about art, when art really works, is that it can quiet all the noise that runs across your body, especially if you live in an urban situation. And what happens when all that noise is quieted is that you begin to hear your own life. And that's a very, very important moment. Because often, whatever's in front of you at that moment begins to really turn in your own psyche. I've never thought that, you know, the project could dramatically change the way that people think. Rather, I think we can shift consciousness by about 1 degree. And I'm happy with that 1 degree. I'm happy that that may be the beginning of someone looking at things in a slightly different way. And that is the power of these these artist books. You know, thousands of years ago, the ancient Assyrians lived in a world that was almost like a semiotic world. They lived in a world of signs and portents. And they assembled a book at one point that had 10,000 omens in it. And that covered everything you can imagine. I mean, most of the omens were for how a war would turn out, or whether to start a war, or how to defend from a war. But it also extended into personal life. And it included things like a flock of birds suddenly rising and turning to the left instead of the right. It could include how somebody walked or a mark on their body that might be auspicious. And when I was reading about that, I thought to myself, well, you know, that is much like the work in this project. Because this project, when you see an exhibit like this with all this work, it seems to gather together and rise up in its own kind of omen and portent of something. I mean, that is really the power of bringing all this work together in one place. And so, you know, I have to really honor those places that take on something like this. So that really goes for Rochester. So the project, as time has gone on, has begun to address everything from freedom of speech to the free exchange of ideas to censorship. We address a lot of things that have to do with the book, with reading, with writing. And one of the most important things is the idea of the commonality between a street like Mutanabbi Street and any street here that holds a cultural institution, a library, a university, a bookstore. I like to say that wherever someone sits down and begins to write towards the truth, or where someone picks up a book to read, that is where Mutanabbi Street starts. And that there is room on that street for all of us, all the artists and writers in this room, for all the readers to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Iraqi people. There are a bunch of cold figures that represent human lives. And that is that in Iraq, we've lost more than 4,000 of our own sons and daughters, and more than 30,000 wounded. And for the Iraqi people, the lowest figure that you can find is 125,000 civilians who have been killed. And another 125,000 that have been wounded. More than 2 million Iraqis left the country for the surrounding region just for safety. More than 1 million have been displaced within the country. But Iraq and the Iraqis, in the midst of all this carnage, go on with their daily lives. It's extraordinary. I mean, one of the things that we always say when we have a horrific attack here, whether it's the Boston bombing, or whether it's 9/11, is that we will not let the terrorists stop our daily lives. But what if those bombings were happening every single day across the city of Rochester? What if you woke up and you heard bombings across the city on a weekly basis? What if people that you knew who were friends and loved ones simply disappeared or turned a corner at the wrong moment and were killed in a bomb blast? I mean, the challenge is, how do you live your daily life in a situation like that? How do you go on from day to day? But Iraqis still do, and we have a lot of them in our project, and a lot of Arab Americans in our project. And the Iraqis just, to me, represent a a wonderful stubbornness to go on with their life. I mean, they simply do not want to give up. And I admire that tremendously. And there also have been so many Iraqis that have come up to me and acknowledged one really almost intangible thing about the project, which is that they have thanked me for seeing them, for acknowledging that they exist, that they want no more than to live an ordinary life. So those are some of the things that we address. That's some of the things that this work addresses and tries to get people to think about. We simply don't want this art to sit in a bookcase and be looked at without somebody thinking about it. It's not an art exhibit, and I have a kind of constant conflict with curators who want to have nothing to do with me standing here and talking about what I'm talking. They only want to show the work, and their comment is often, the work speaks for itself. Well, the work can speak for itself, but if you're not ready to hear it, you're not going to hear anything. And part of the associated events that we do, whether they're talks by members of the project or whether they're panel discussions, is to get people ready to hear something, you know. This work is powerful, but it has to be amplified by talking about why it was made and why it continues to exist, why this project continues to exist. I was in London in March where we had an exhibit at the Arab British Center, and there was a guy who was the chief curator from the Imperial War Museum. And so he said to me, you know, how does this project help Iraqis? And I said, you know, the project doesn't directly help Iraqis, but what it does do is let them know that someone sees them, that someone hears them, and that cultural workers in our community are doing work that reflects that knowledge, that we don't see ourselves as any different from them. And I can't tell you how many Iraqis have come up to me, people who have found out about the project and thanked me. Likewise, for the broadsides, you know, broadsides are, they often have a poem on it. They're yay big. The type is set by hand, one letter at a time. They date back hundreds of years. I like to say that what we have come to call first responders is what letterpress printers are, because through our history, they have responded to national tragedies or the aspirations of a more just society with a broadsheet that was put up on a tree or on the side of a building. It's why you always read about, you know, the military going into a town and immediately going to the local print shop and breaking the printing press and distributing the type. For the people who attacked Mutanabbi Street, it wasn't even so much what was in the book at that moment. It's what might be in the next book. They simply wanted the writers and artists in that community to know that they had the ultimate power to destroy everything that was made. I said the other night that we have someone in the project that is named Stephanie Sauer from Brazil, who did a book called I Dare You. And the instructions with that book are for the curator of the exhibit to, at the end of the exhibit, to burn that book, to destroy it. Because Stephanie says, I will make another. And that's part of this project. We will make another. We will continue to make another. This is a project of witness and memory. And memory is an important part of every book in this collection here in Rochester. It's part of what books are about. So this project will continue. We're in the midst of a call to printmakers to join the project, and we have more than 200 who have signed up. In terms of the artist books, we have artist book makers from more than 20 different countries have contributed work. We've shown this work extensively in the United States and in Canada, in Ireland, many places in the UK. And we have an exhibit that's up right now at the American University in Cairo. The broadsides have been in a small show in Baghdad, quite close to Mutanabbi Street, as part of a poetry festival. Mutanabbi Street, it took about a year for them to bring the street back. And I say in my introduction to the anthology that a good friend of mine, whose name is Maysoon Pachachi, an Iraqi documentary filmmaker based in London, she wrote me that we'll see how long it takes for Mutanabbi Street to get its soul back. And I wrote her and said, well, we'll see how long it takes for my own country to get its soul back. I always say that this project is not an anti-war project, although every member of this project is against war. And the reason I say that is it's too easy for people to brush aside what you're doing under the label of anti-war. It's just one more anti-war project. And we are not a healing project. One cannot begin to heal until you understand the extent of the wounds. And the wounds that we have left behind in Iraq are wounds that will be coming to the surface for generations. So we're not trying to make things better. We're not trying to make the artists who are part of this project feel better, even. I like to say that these exhibits should be troublesome in the very best sense of the word. You should struggle with your own conscience, with your own feelings about what has happened and what continues to happen. More than 5,000 civilians have died in Baghdad, in Iraq since January. I mean, the war may be over for us, but someone left the on switch still on in Iraq, and so people continue to die every single day. And this country, my own country, is just desperate to walk away from Iraq. So that is something that we address as well. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to expand on anything I've said. Yeah, she wanted to know what the status of Mutanabbi Street was right now. The street has come back. Books are being sold. There are still poetry readings at times there, often music. There are blast walls on both parts. One of the essays in the anthology is from Musa al-Nassari, who was a stationery salesman on Mutanabbi Street and in that area, because there are a lot of stationery stores on the street, as well as print shops. And Musa tells a story about he went back and forth past that car with the car bomber sitting in it 3 or 4 times that morning. And the street was going to begin to be filled up with people, and this guy wasn't moving his car. Usually people were bringing books out right onto the street, onto the sidewalk from the stores. And one of the owners of one of the stores actually came out and argued with him and told him to move the car, but it was a young man and he just sat there in stony silence looking straight ahead. And it was only maybe 10 or 15 minutes later that he blew himself and all these other people up. So the fact that, I mean, there are a lot of people that want this project to have a goal. When I was in, my wife and I went to the UK last summer with the express purpose of traveling and meeting as many of the book artists and printers that we could that were part of the project from the UK. And at one point, someone set up an interview with the BBC for me. And it was for BBC World News, and I thought, well, this will be great to get the word of the project out. But before they do an interview, they do a pre-interview. So this woman said to me on the telephone, so what is the goal of the project? And I said, the project has no goal except to continue. And she said, yeah, I understand. But what is the goal of the project? I said, we have no goal. I mean, she desperately wanted to see an end point, you know? And I refused to give her that. Needless to say, I never got the interview on the BBC. And I sometimes tell this anecdote. I said it the other night here, that if this was a project about putting a glazed donut in the hands of every child in Baghdad, we would have high school seniors baking through the night. And why is that? Because once you had made your tray of donuts, you were absolved. You could walk away. You had done your part. That's not what this project is about, and that's why we don't have a goal. And that's why, to some people, we are a constant irritant, because we simply refuse to go away. And that's what they want us to do. So, all of my answers will be like 10 times longer than your questions. Yeah?
Have you visited that part of the world before the explosion? How did you know the reputation of the street?
I only knew about it from the article in the New York Times. I had not been there. You know, I mean, some of the first questions I got when I formed the coalition of writers and artists were, well, are you Arab American? No, I'm not, I would say. And then they would look at me like, well, why are you doing this? You know? So I hadn't been there. I had planned to go when we sent a complete set of our broadsides is now part of the permanent collection of the National Library in Baghdad. And my wife and I were going to go, but the security situation was such that the head of the library just advised me not to come. So I haven't been. I hope one day, really in my heart of hearts, that, you know, I'll sit in one of the cafes, in the Shabandar Cafe. I mean, I would just feel so great to do that, you know. You know, the street has always existed where you could pretty much buy anything, you know, in all kinds of languages. And the street really welcomed all kinds of people, both Shia and Sunni, Kurdish. I mean, every group and minority in Iraq was welcomed on that street. I think it has more to do with power. You know, it has more to do whether it's secular power or clerical power. Those who want power ultimately go after artists and writers. I mean, it just happens. And if you can intimidate an artist and writer enough that they begin to self-censor their own work, that's a great goal for anyone who wants power. And you have to strike fear in their heart in one way or another. You know, and I was reading an article recently about when The Grapes of Wrath came out. In the Central Valley in California, they had public book burnings of that book because it was seen as such a communist tract that it took the plight of the farm workers. And now that's a book that's on reading lists for high schools all the time. But they were afraid of that book, and there was a photograph of this heap of copies of The Grapes of Wrath being burned. One thing that Stephanie Sauer has in that, she did a video of herself making her book and then destroying it. But she also put a voice track reciting from BC all the way to Mutanabbi Street, every recorded instance of books and writers being attacked. It goes on for about 13 minutes of her reciting as she's making and destroying this book. And you realize that, Mutanabbi Street is not an isolated event historically. Books have always been under attack. And probably some of the worst attacks are in gradual steps, very small things. And those are really the things that you have to address before it becomes something really large. That's one thing that I've learned in this project is that I never want to have the feeling of walking away from a conversation thinking to myself, I should have said something. I want to say it right then. And I want to let the chips fall where they may. But you have to speak out. You cannot decide when the right time to do that is. So often that can be something really small. And that's one thing we encourage with this project, is do something, One of the things that feedback that I've gotten from book artists and printers is that they have come up to me and thanked me for giving them an opportunity to use the work that they normally do to address a situation like this. There's just a tremendous power in the book arts that is not usually used for social activist situations. But we are doing that, and we'll continue to do that. Yeah?
Is there more than one exhibit going on concurrently, or is this one tonight?
There is an exhibit right now in Cairo, of a portion of the books. There's an exhibit that's opening in the middle of June in Halifax, in Canada, at a university there. We have an exhibit that's opening at Goddard in Vermont, and they're going to begin to incorporate some of the ideas of the project into curriculum. I want to continue to add other art disciplines. I want to continue to try to find artists who feel like what we're doing resonates with their own practice. So I want there to be a photography arm of the project. I've already leaned on some people while I've been here. I want to lean on more. And we have this printmaking project. So it's important what we're doing. It's important that we let artists see through this project a myriad number of things to address. We're not monolithic in that sense. So Mutanabbi Street is not our ending point. Mutanabbi Street is our starting point. And we feel that the issues that we've raised over the bombing of that street resonate all across the globe in places. So it's really important what we're doing. But at the same time, I don't have any illusions about that we are the be-all or end-all of projects addressing these things. There's tons of other small projects that people have done, but we're part of all of that. Yeah. Well, this project operates essentially as an NGO, so we don't really talk about politics in that sense. Anything I say about politics is my own personal opinion. But yeah, well, one of the things that I said the other night was that when I went to our exhibit that we had in New York last summer, on one of the days, the day before I left, I decided to go to the 9/11 memorial. And it's a really devastating moment when you go in there and see these slabs of like polished granite maybe surrounding these pools of running water. And I just found myself walking, there's two of them there for the two towers, walking around running my fingertips over these names of these people, the closest I could get to all these lives that were lost in that moment. And then I thought later, when I went back, I was just kind of ruined for the rest of the day. But when I went back to my hotel, I sat there and I thought, you know, if you started making pools for all of our sons and daughters who have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, that would be a couple more pools. And if you started making pools of similar size for all the Iraqi civilian deaths, that would be about 80 more pools. And for the Afghan civilian deaths, more pools. And then I sat down and I thought, well, suppose those pools ran from where I was in New York City at that moment all the way to San Francisco where I live. That would be a pool about every 30 miles. Every 30 miles. Can you imagine that's like a day trip for a family to go and run their fingertips across the names of all these people that we don't know who have died in this. So yeah. We've signed what they call a memo of understanding with Indiana University / Purdue University. And they are going to archive one complete set of everything from the project. They're going to digitize it. But when I began to correspond with them, and the woman that I corresponded with, whose name is Sonia Strum, I told her that I didn't want a regular archival situation. I didn't want this work to be put back in the rare book room and taken out once every 5 years and dusted off and shown again. I said I wanted an active partner. I wanted someone who would take over shipping the work, and we agreed finally on they would ship to 6 exhibits each year that we would agree to, that the project would agree to, and that they would agree to. And then I proposed, everything I proposed to them, she would write me back and say, that's a great idea, Bo. And so I had my last card was, well, I said, this is the deal breaker. I want a symposium that addresses Al-Mutanabbi Street and that brings in artists and writers to talk about the issues that we have raised. And she wrote back, I thought she was going to say, well, we can't do something like that, you know. She wrote back and said, that's another good idea, you know. So they're going to do one every 2 years. The first one will be this November, and in 2016 they'll show all the artist books, just like you guys are showing, and all the prints as well, and the broadsides. So they're actively becoming partners in what we do. We've had a lot of back and forth emails. One of the first things they proposed for the first symposium was that there was going to be a kind of an interfaith breakfast. And I wrote them back and said, you know, that isn't what this is about. You know, they had partnered up with an interfaith group that had led them into the refugee community in Indianapolis. I said, you know, this has really got to be about Iraq and Iraqis, and this is not a healing project. And they wrote me back and said, you know, we were wrong. And they reconfigured what the symposium was going to look like. So I find people like that. You know, there are people who have canceled our exhibits. I like to say that I've been ignored, patronized, and insulted by some of the biggest arts organizations in the United States. But people step forward. I mean, people just respond to this project. And it's often really unexpected. You know, one of our members is a poet named Elisa Lucy, who's in Detroit. And we had a panel at an Arab American conference in Detroit. Hardly anybody came to the panel, maybe 12 people, to hear us. But one of those people was Elise, who had already contributed a poem to the anthology. You'll see her poem in the book. And Elise came up to me after the panel was over and she said, I want to do more. You know, tell me to do something. And I said, okay. I said, that's a dangerous thing to say to me, you know. And we had an exhibit in Detroit at Wayne State University. We had then an exhibit of broadsides and some of the first artist books at a local letterpress in Detroit. And then Elise wrote me last year and said, you know, there's a thing called the Knights Challenge Grant for arts, and they're going to do something in Detroit. And you have to write a proposal of 1 paragraph. And it's in 3 days. What do you think? I said, of course, it sounds impossible. Let's do that, you know. And so she wrote up the paragraph. I made some changes on it. And she submitted it. And we made the first cut, which was like from 1,500 proposals down to 150. And then we had to fill out a long form on what it would look like if we brought the project to Detroit, what we would do with it. And we wanted to bring it into the schools. We wanted to work with the Arab National Museum, that's right near Detroit. And we got stuck at a certain point because they wanted us to present a way that would examine how successful the project had been if they gave us the grant. And Elise is a poet and I'm a poet. We just don't travel in that world of grant writing, you know. And I said to her, you know, I met somebody in London who is part of a project called Real Iraq that has actually worked with Iraqi writers in Iraq in the Kurdistan region, and they've done films. It's just a great group of activists. And I wrote to one of their members whom I had met, and I said, can you help us? And he wrote back and he said, well, right now I'm in Ireland. I'm looking after my sister's kids, but here's what I think they want to hear. And he wrote like 3 paragraphs on how to measure what the success would be, and we got the grant just from that. So that's one thing about this kind of networking of people that we have begun to have. And Elise got called into a PR agency in Detroit that was handling this because the Knight Foundation is in Florida. And they said to Elise, go into this room, there's a monitor in that room, somebody from the Knight Foundation is going to talk to you. And so Elise thought, well, they're going to tell me that they need more information about the project. So she went in and sat down. She stared at the woman on the screen until finally the woman on the screen said, who are you? And Elise said, found her tongue and said, I'm with the Mutanabbi Street project. And the woman said, oh, I want to tell you, you got the grant. And Elise just began to cry. And she kept crying for the next couple of minutes. And the woman said, you know, maybe we should talk about the details of this a little later. So we're going to be in Detroit. We're going to be in the schools in Detroit. We're trying to write some curriculum to go along with that. And in 2016, we're going to be in Washington, D.C. We're going to work with several universities. There's already a committee that's been formed there with one of our project members, a printmaker named Helen Fredericks, who's leading it. We're going to be all over that city with work, and which will include other aspects of the arts, including dance and drama, film and photography. So, yeah, we're going to stick around. Thank you all for coming.